Thanks for coming out today. Today I'm talking about modern JavaScript, moving beyond jQuery. Before I get started, I'm just going to give a brief history of myself. I'm a father of 3 kids. I volunteer with a nonprofit law firm called Community Justice back in Wisconsin in the United States. Right now I'm a senior engineer working remotely for a company called TurnTo Networks, and I love making pizza at home. So just for those of you who are not familiar with where Wisconsin is, just got a little map, the north central parts of the United States. Some things that we really like there are we like our sports. We like our American football, which is the football where we don't really use our feet that much. Unlike the football in the rest of the world. This is our hometown mascot for our university, Bucky Badger. And I think we're similar to the Netherlands that we really like beer and cheese. So today we're going to talk about how to move past very basic like jQuery style JavaScript. I'm going to go through some examples of how you can use it for a quick prototype, like if you want to get something up and running in front of a client really quickly. Ways to add incremental functionality to your already existing pages. We're going to talk about objects, and we're going to talk about creating objects in ways that are testable, even though we won't really go into testing because we don't have time for that. So there's a lot of iterations of JavaScript out there right now. With Node, JavaScript is running like everywhere. Today we're just talking about the browser. And we're talking about complementing and adding functionality to your PHP. I mean, realistically, it could be any backend language, but this is a PHP conference, so I'll be talking about a PHP backend. But this is a talk for PHP developers, learning how to add functionality on the front end. And there's a lot of great tools in the browser, which probably you already know about. And so we're not going into like I said, server-side or single-page apps. This is about things that are functioning with your PHP. So I just want to do a quick poll of the audience. Who here hates JavaScript? Okay, a few hands. That's getting less. The first time I gave this talk 2 years ago, like most of the room raised their hands. So I think people are slowly getting accustomed to having to deal with JavaScript. But the reason I got this talk together is that I know a lot of PHP or Java developers that just hate it so much, and they cringe when they have to write it. But if you want your application to run with a nice responsive interface, JavaScript you're going to need to use it at some point. Or somebody on your team is going to have to use it, and having an understanding of what they're doing is going to help you. So I'm just going to give a brief, really fast history, a very incomplete history of JavaScript. Early on, in the early days of the web, we had static web pages, and we just wanted to add some dynamic features to them. So JavaScript was a way to do that. But a long time ago, there were no real good standards. So writing JavaScript was really, really hard because you had to write for different browsers, and they did not agree at all. So I think that's why a lot of plugins came out, like Flash and ActiveX. Of course, ActiveX was only an Internet Explorer technology, and Flash, I cringe at Flash, and it's not nearly as popular as it used to be. Then there were all these big libraries like Dojo and UE from the Yahoo and others, where they just like packed everything you could into a package, and they were these huge packages, but they were useful because all of a sudden someone else was doing the hard work of figuring out how to get it to work in lots of different browsers. And I think because of all this frustration with JavaScript, this is my idea of why jQuery became so popular, because all of a sudden they gave you this selector syntax, which made it so easy to manipulate the DOM. And you could just get access and change things in your page very easily. You could bind to events. and click handlers, that type of thing. They even had their own like UI, jQuery UI. So I mean, they still have it. And so this really took us a huge step forward JavaScript-wise. And I'm not going to diss on jQuery because I think it's a very useful tool. But today we're going to talk about ways you can still use jQuery with the examples I have, but ways to use it in a more structured format. The other big advancement that happened, not sure if it was before or after jQuery, but was AJAX, where people started having asynchronous requests to get data to their page. So this brought browser development up a huge level and enabled things like single-page apps and all the other frameworks to happen. So what do we need to do to move beyond jQuery and make things a little bit more modern? Now that so when I talked about the browsers not agreeing, luckily the ECMA group, I don't remember what that stands for, but they came up with ECMAScript, which is essentially a standard. And it took a while to get all the browsers to get on board. But once they did, all of a sudden you kind of have this core set of JavaScript that you can run across any browsers. So now you can go to the Microsoft Developer Network or the Mozilla Developer Network or Chrome, and they have documentation about what their browser supports. And it's, for the most part, going to be shared between the browsers. And this is a huge step forward. And I think it was last year, it may have been a little longer, the version 6 of ECMA came out. So they added a lot of new functionality. So this really helps us as developers. So now you can write what some people refer to as vanilla JavaScript, which means just JavaScript that lives in the browser. You don't have to load anything like jQuery. But jQuery is still a little bit easier. You can see by this example, the get element by ID, or just the selector syntax. The selector syntax is a little bit more concise, but you don't need jQuery if you don't want to use it. I assume most people are probably familiar with the web console. If you're doing any any JavaScript development, this is the console and the debugger are hugely important. This is one nice thing about the fact that JavaScript is running in the browser is that you get a built-in debugger, and you can just start debugging without setting up Xdebug and your IDE and all that. So you just debug directly in the browser. So, and before I get started with the code, feel free to stop me at any time for questions. I'll leave time for questions at the end. And you can also see me, after the talk or in the hallways or whatever. So I'm going to start with kind of the basic idea of, a model view controller app that we're writing in PHP. Your browser submits a form. PHP saves the data somehow, probably, retrieves data from a database and sends a response to a client. This is the basic life cycle of a PHP app, more or less. And JavaScript can, in this model, you're always waiting for that full round trip to get back to your web browser, which you may want something more responsive. So before I get started in some of the code examples, this is just a little prototype app that I was writing for that nonprofit law firm that I work for, or that I volunteer with, and it's just a little bit of form and a list that gets populated after that. So my examples are kind of referencing this form, so I just want to give you that as a basis point for where we're going. So this is an example that I've seen a lot of code like this. This is a very beginning jQuery way of writing the code. Does anyone want to guess at what some problems with this type of code are? What's that? Yes, readability is one. It's very hard to understand what this is doing. Exactly. Your view code and your logic are intertwined inextricably. And what if you want to, you want to start adding some columns to this? How easy is this? Or if you want to write a test for this, other than like an integration test, it would be extremely challenging. Another problem is try giving this to another developer, especially if this is a more complex app. This is an incredibly simple example. I've seen jQuery apps written like this where, you've just got like hundreds of lines on a single page just to move some very simple data around. So this is I see a lot of code like this, and we want to move beyond this. So let's take a look and see what we can do to change it. But before that, I'm just going to give you a very quick background in JavaScript. So there's a couple of tips and tricks that you need to know about writing in JavaScript, some things that will maybe either be useful or will trip you up. One thing that kind of throws me off, or when I first started writing JavaScript, was the way they do the scope. In the first example, var makes the scope local to your script, or local to like your class. However, if you leave that out, it's going to be a global variable. So by default, a variable in JavaScript is global, which global variables are not something that's really a good practice these days. And with that ECMAScript 6, they actually introduce a new scope, which is instead of var, you can use let, and let just puts you in the block scope that you're in. So if it's at the class level, it's going to apply to the class, but you can actually put it in a for loop, and the variable will get created inside that for loop. Obviously, when you're writing JavaScript, console.log is going to be your friend. The debugger is too, but console.log is going to be a great way to just see stuff spit out right at the bottom of the browser. The other thing that you'll need to know, and I'll explain this in a little bit more detail in just a minute, but the class inheritance for JavaScript is very different because it's prototype based. It's not class based the way you would normally think about it. So I'll get into that in a little bit, but this is just something you need to know, because if you're starting to write anything a little bit advanced and you start with inheritance, you're going to run into some weird stuff that's not working the way you would expect. So just to give you a quick example of how the scope works, I just created this quick silly little script where you've got this variable called counter, and for some reason we're just passing into these functions. I'm just showing you the difference between local and global. So in the first one, local, you actually are going to have two variables called counter, because your counter variable gets recreated in that function. However, in the second one, that's actually it's going to be a global context. So if you just call this a whole bunch of times, you're going to get some interesting behavior. For example, the first time you have it locally, it's getting recreated. In local, it's getting created every time. So even though you're passing it in, it's just still set to 0. So your global one is 0. However, when you do that loop later down here, when you do that loop in your global set, you're actually adding to it. So it's changing that first var that you have. So that's just something that you need to watch out for, is your scopes, because like I said, it's a little bit different than the way other languages might deal with the scope. So when we're writing PHP code, hopefully we're writing good, well-designed objects that are testable, not necessarily, maybe reusable, maybe not, but at least we're thinking about our design, we're creating good objects. So there's really no reason we can't do that in JavaScript, except that early on I've seen a lot of developers not do it because they just didn't know how. So let's get into that and see what this looks like. So this is a basic class in JavaScript. This is my model class. There's actually a number of different ways to set up a class in JavaScript, especially with the way the inheritance works. But and another thing that you need to watch out for in JavaScript is that a function is a class. So this is a function, but a function is an object. They don't really have the definition of classes per se in JavaScript. They're just objects. But this is how you would define a class in the way you're thinking about it for, like if you were writing it in PHP. So, something that's a little strange here is that this function is essentially your class constructor. So, for example, in the parentheses there, you can pass in initialization parameters if you want to load data in when you construct that object. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the prototypical inheritance. This is very complicated, and I'll just try to touch on it a little bit. But if you have questions, feel free to stop me or see me after the talk. And I put some good resources at the end of the talk too. In PHP, we're accustomed to you define a class, and then later you instantiate that class. You can also inherit from that class. And I know there are ways to do composition-based inheritance as well. But for this example, I'm just really talking about the standard types of inheritance. In JavaScript, there's no such thing as creating a class definition. We're kind of faking it by creating these functions that are really a whole function itself. For example, I could set this to a variable and then just start using this as an object and start putting data in it right away. That would be a little weird because I'm trying to keep a good design here and define what the class means. Now, with the prototypes in JavaScript, you'll see here one way to inherit what's coming in from your parent class is by doing this attorney model.call. Essentially what that does is it calls the constructor of that, and so it's going to bring in these 4 variables into your class. Now, in a language like PHP, you're going to have your class definition, and when you create a new object in it, everything's going to be defined in that class. Even if you inherit it, it brings it down. JavaScript has a different way of dealing with that. It actually puts down pointers to everything that's the same in the base class, and everything inherits from object. So you'll get these pointers back for everything that hasn't changed from your object, from your attorney model, from your attorney manager model. So so there's this big long inheritance chain, and I would suggest if you're going to start doing some inheritance that you go to the Mozilla Developer Network and read up about that. They've got some really good examples of what that can mean for you. But it's just a little bit different because you're not getting a full copy of your definition, and it actually means that you can kind of change stuff higher up, and then it you don't know where it gets affected depending on when you instantiate this and when you call that constructor. So that gets a little confusing because you're actually creating an object at this time. So now that we've talked about the prototypes, let's move on to what does it mean, how do we store objects and create objects in JavaScript. Right here I've just got an object that's going to hold on to my list of attorneys that's going to show up on that form. And a little trick that I have at the top here, I set this var self equals this. The reason I do that is because this will change context depending on where you're at. Is everybody here or I should say, is anyone not familiar with the concept of callback functions? Okay, so I won't go into explain. I'll just say, so if you're in like especially if you're in a callback function or some type of loop like that, this is going to refer to that context, and it's not going to be this. So you can have this dot something and this dot something, that same thing in the same class, but they totally mean different contexts. So if you set it to your own variable, and in this case I just call it self, you can refer to your top level model throughout, and you always know what you mean. So this is really basic, but it's starting to look a little bit more like what you would do in possibly do in PHP. We've got some functions to add a model to our list, and we are able to return everything in the list to our view. We're still not as far along as we want to be, because you can see here we still have our HTML code coupled into our logic, which is not ideal. The nice thing that with this is, though, this is just kind of a data model. It's not it's not dealing with the logic of how we get the objects in there or when we display them. So here's an object to deal with our view, and you can see here all of a sudden our JavaScript is starting to look very readable. This is, I think you can kind of understand exactly what's going to happen in all of these functions. Unlike where we started at before with the jQuery, where it was just, if you got to this level of logic, you would end up with like 100 lines of code that was very unreadable. So just to expand that a little bit, here's what we're doing with our add model to list. We're just taking the elements out of there, and I kind of mixed up plain vanilla JavaScript and jQuery just to show you that you can use either one. And in this context, this is a great way to use jQuery because it can be a lot easier to get instead of saying document.getElementById.value, it's just you can use your selectors. You can get to stuff a lot quicker. So this is one place where I really like using jQuery, but it's up to you. You don't have to use it if you don't want to, or you can't for some reason. So the last thing that I'm doing here, after I set up my I get my model, I add it to my list, and then we refresh. We tell the view, okay, repopulate yourself. And that's the second function here. So we've got this code that is just set up to interact with our view. And it's very clean and readable. We're just getting the attorney table, and we are taking the table rows and putting them in there. Now, like I said, of course, we've still got HTML in our model code, which is not ideal, but we'll deal with that in just a minute. And our init function is just setting up an event listener on our button. And this is, like I said, this is another example of a non-jQuery way to do it. So any questions so far? Are you all still with me? Okay. So before we take this another step further, I want to talk to you about something that can be extremely useful when creating a prototype for a client. This is one thing that I've done quite often. Before you go and build your PHP, your backend, your database, or anything, you can get a functional page going just by using browser storage. Who here is familiar with how the browser storage works? Okay, so I'll go through it pretty quickly. You've got the local storage and you've got the session storage, and the session storage is tied to the browser tab, whereas local storage will persist and not get wiped out with that. And it uses, for security reasons, it uses the same origin policy, so it's going to be tied to the domain name that's setting that browser storage. However, I would not rely on it for anything that you want to keep secure, because this is not, it's saved on the client. So no matter how well you encrypt that data and you put it in there, I wouldn't really trust it, because you never know if there's going to be a flaw found in a web browser or whatever. But what I've done with this is taken it and set it up so that all of a sudden you're saving data and you're retrieving that data so fast for your for your customer. And I've actually been in client meetings where I'm meeting with that customer, and you can go to the console, the web console, and you can enter any JavaScript command you want in that web console. So you can type in local storage.set item. All of a sudden, you can start. There's one time where this client just got hung up on, oh, well, we want the names in this drop-down list to be that. And I said, okay. And they couldn't get past that the drop-down names were what they told me at the last meeting, and they weren't changed yet. So, and I wanted to move on to, okay, I understand we're going to change that text for you. Let's move on and let's move on and talk about new functionality. What more do you want? Do you like the way this is moving? And they just kept saying, okay, are you going to change that dropdown? So after a few times with that, I just went into the browser console. I cleared out the variable that was in the browser storage, and I just typed a couple commands to add the text that they wanted. And then all of a sudden, that meeting, instead of having to go back with the meeting without making good decisions and then come back for yet another meeting, we were able to get a lot more work done. So that's one place where browser storage can be really, really useful. And so when I was creating this prototype for a client, I started using the local storage this way. I just created a save function, and I took my data in there, and I changed it to a JSON string, and I saved it, and that's it. And then I created a load function that just pulls that out and parses it with JSON so that it hydrates it back into an object. And this was extremely useful because I didn't have to write a lot of code, so I got something very quickly up in front of the client. Within like a day or two of talking about, okay, what do you want? Come back to them a day or two later, and I show them an example. And that way they can focus early on in your design process on working out the details. And then we came up with some really good, once we got past that drop-down issue, we got through some really good feedback because they got to see it actually working, not just like still photos or anything like that. So this really brought us forward and made our meetings so much more productive because we were able to really quickly get back to them and say, okay, you want it to do this. Okay, you want it to do this. And we kept going iteration and iteration, and we had this iterative development. So we created like the whole, well, not the whole, but a lot of the front end. And then later we started writing our back-end PHP code and our APIs and stuff like that. So, but designing it this way was really easy because then we just kind of swapped out these functions later and started doing API calls to get that information. So this is, this is basically the same as before. The only two differences is, on our init, we're just now loading the data from storage, and we're saving the data when we, in this case, when the view refreshes, we save that data. The nice thing is that later, when we hook up to a backend, I didn't change this code at all. So I've kind of brought us into a pattern. Is anyone familiar with the model view model pattern? Okay, just a few. This was something actually created by Microsoft a long time ago, not for the web. I won't even get into the history of that, but it's it's very similar to the model view controller, but it's just it's really meant for when you're working on the client side code. Essentially, it's the same idea as the model view controller, where you've got your view, your HTML, and then you've got your view model, which is, I don't really like the terminology for that, but it's essentially the code that's going back and forth between your model and your view. And then you've got your model on its own. So keeping those separate is very useful, and leads to some good design. So let's see what more we can add. I'm just going to introduce really quickly here a little bit of a framework, or just a little bit on this framework called Knockout. The reason that I'm using this framework for these examples is that it's extremely easy to just drop in and start using little bits of it, unlike a huge thing like Angular, where you have to just kind of go all in and learn all of it. This one is very easy to learn and get started with. And what I'm going to be using it for here is binding our data to our model, and that's going to allow us to get rid of that keeping the HTML in our model. So you can see here, and Knockout is just one of many frameworks that do this. So there's a lot of other options out there if you know about another one or want to choose one. So right here you can see all we have to do is add in some data bind commands. It just is an extension on the HTML. So we're binding the data, and we're binding the click event to our button. This makes it really easy to start doing stuff quickly, because, like I said, you're not changing a lot about your HTML page, like a lot of other JavaScript frameworks that kind of make you rethink the way you're developing, or use a new templating language or something like that. This just lets you get into your HTML. You can take, a lot of times I've taken HTML from like our designer. It doesn't know any coding at all, and then you can just take that and then start popping in your data bind tags. And then you just tell them, okay, if you make changes, don't touch the data bind tags. Yes?
CSS started out this way with inline CSS and HTML tags. Is this going to go down the same road in the future? Do you foresee that?
Going down the same road as CSS tags.
Style attribute.
I'm not quite sure. I don't think that this framework is quite popular enough to to have the same following as CSS and getting to be a real standard. And it seems like a lot of the JavaScript frameworks they're doing a lot of very similar things, yet they all do it a little differently, unfortunately. So I don't think they're going to get to the way we deal with CSS, where it's a lot more just kind of built into the browser, unfortunately. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I just wondered because everybody was against the intrusiveness of the style attribute. This could get intrusive in the same way, making it the same length, but it's still an attribute in your tag.
Yes, exactly. You're adding stuff to the tag, and yes. So, and I think you have to be, just like with the style versus the class attribute in CSS, you have to be careful how you use it. You can end up adding a lot of code in that data bind, but you probably don't want to add more than just the basics of what you need. So I think with any tool, with any framework, you have to be careful about how you use it. I mean, you can. So in my experience, I try to just make the data binds fairly minimal. For example, here we're just saying, okay, this is what the text is. This replaces the text, and we bound the click to the A. You're right. It's starting to get a little busy because we've got the data bind at the table body level. And so, but I try to keep it to just one element in each one, because otherwise you start getting this mess of, all of a sudden you start putting logic in your view, which you don't want to be doing. You want to keep that logic out in your models and in your view model. So no, that's a very good point. Thanks for bringing that up. Yes. So this is another special thing that Knockout uses. It's the idea of observables. And this is how Knockout does its work to map your model to those data binds. So their syntax is just KO for Knockout dot observable, and it's actually creates an object, which is why there's parentheses there. So it's turning your variable into a special object that has real-time data binding. So if you change first name, it automatically is reflected on that HTML. You don't have to do anything to refresh the page like we were doing before when we were writing just pure JavaScript. Excuse me. So, and to pull the data out, it's when we're saving it, it's very straightforward. But again, since these are objects, we're actually pulling it out. Knockout has you pull it out as a function, so that then it returns. It actually will return the data for you, so that you can save it into your list. And initializing it is very easy. It's a little bit different than just initializing a variable, because again, we're passing it in to the function and setting that. And initializing it the same way, just with the blank strings. So, and the other kind of magic thing that you have to do with Knockout is you have to tell it, okay, I've created an object, and I want you to, this is the object that I want you to bind to my HTML page. So essentially all those observable variables that we created are in our form model, and we apply that, and then all of a sudden every time that our logic changes what's in that form model object, it's automatically getting updated. You could write that yourself in JavaScript if you wanted, but it would be a lot of work. So this is where I think it's a good example of a time to take advantage of a framework like Knockout. Now that we've created this prototype and our client is happy with it, like I said, you can move it into your PHP. Since you're all familiar with, or most of you are familiar with, excuse me, familiar with callbacks, I'll just briefly say, this is asynchronous, which means that it's going to, send out the data, and then once it gets sent back, it's not going to block and wait for it. It's just going to, come back and populate your page, especially with the observable variables. So you sometimes, if you're doing like a long-running data call, you see that where you load the page, and then all of a sudden, then your list populates. But at least and another benefit to that is, you get your page loaded right away, and then you start, filling in the data. I've actually written some pages where you have a number of these calls, and you take, we're getting from different sources. We've got all these microservices, so we're just hitting all these different microservices. I'm just going to briefly show, this is the Knockout way of doing it. There's actually, which is incredibly similar to the jQuery way of doing it. I think it's a little bit more complex if you're using plain vanilla JavaScript. But those two functions that we had before, the load and the save, all we have to do to start loading that to our backend is change that to a get call, a get to get the data, and a post to post the data. And each time we're turning the JavaScript object either into a JSON string, or we're hydrating it back from a JSON string. Some frameworks do that for you. I always like to handle that myself, just so that I know what's going on. So a lot of this code, now that we've set it up, is we can write tests for this code a lot more easily. I'm not going to get into that today because I just got my 5-minute warning, but the way we've separated stuff, there's a ton of different testing frameworks out there, and all of a sudden we can start testing bits and pieces of our front-end code, which is going to just help us so much. These are some frameworks that I've used. Like I said, there's a lot out there, But QUnit, I don't know if that's as popular as it used to be when I first gave this talk. But I know that Jasmine, actually Karma is another one I should have put up there. Mocha and Jest. Jest is another one we were playing around with 2 days ago, and it was really useful because if you use it with PHP Storm, it actually has a lot of context prompts. So it was really, really easy to get started with. Before I open it up for questions, I'm just going to real quick touch on Vue and React because I get questions about that a lot. These are two other frameworks, and I just took the examples off of their getting started pages. They're a little bit different. You can see all of a sudden you're getting into like a templating language, and you're pushing data out there through these specialized classes. I think that's good, but you're going to have a longer learning curve for something like that. React is very similar in the ID. This is actually, you're setting up your IDs, and you're getting that, and you're pushing data into it. So that's it for today. I encourage you to reach out to me either by Twitter or joined in. And are there any questions that anybody has right now? Yes.
Well, I don't really see the advantage of including the jQuery library for just the selector.
You're right. Actually, that's why I kind of gave both examples. Some people end up having, if they're just adding this to bits and pieces of their app, they may have jQuery in there already because somebody else has already loaded it, has loaded it and needs it for something else. So I was kind of thinking from the signs of taking an existing app and modifying it. But you're right, if I was starting something new, I wouldn't necessarily bring in jQuery because that's another call that your the browser has to go out and get that. Yes. Yes?
Your previous slides, there were no quotes around the constants. That was just a mistake, I hope.
Oh, in the
Because otherwise this would be really weird syntax. The element is hello world.
in this React. This is directly from their website, so that's actually the way they do it. And like I said, that's why there's a little bit of a weird learning curve for these frameworks because it is different. That they're not actually treating it as strings, and it has something to do with the way they parse the stuff out. But and these are very popular frameworks, so I just wanted to kind of give a quick example of that. So.
It creates a JavaScript.
Okay, so yes, so we get that on the recording, that's a compiled string. It's not something that runs directly. That code isn't running directly in the browser. So the React framework is taking care of that. Yes, that's right. JSX is their name for their template. So thank you. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thanks for coming out, and feel free to find me later if you have questions about this or testing or anything else. So, all right, thanks.